My name is Isabella. I'm 42 years old, a ceramic artist living in the hills outside Santa Fe. My Adobe studio overlooks a sprawling desert landscape where I spend countless hours shaping clay into vessels that capture the essence of the high desert while creating pottery collections for galleries across the Southwest. That tranquil existence was shattered one Thursday evening when my husband of 15 years walked through our front door with an expression I'd never seen before. Marcus entered our home carrying a manila folder, his face stone cold, as he placed it on our handcrafted dining table. Before I could ask what was wrong, he spoke in a voice devoid of warmth. Before we continue with today's story, if you're enjoying what you've heard so far, please hit that subscribe button. Every new subscriber helps me keep sharing these inspiring tales that touch your day. Thank you for your support. These are divorce papers. I need you to sign them. And starting next month, you'll need to send me $12,000 monthly. You barely contribute anything meaningful anyway. I stood frozen, staring at this man as if he were a complete stranger. But it wasn't the divorce documents that shocked me most. It was the woman standing behind him in our doorway. Claire. Claire, my college roommate, my closest confidant, the person who had been my maid of honor and knew every dream and fear I'd ever shared. Now she stood there, her arm linked with Marcus's, wearing a smile that suggested everything I once held dear now belonged to her. I took a deep breath. 1,000 questions flooded my mind, but only one response escaped my lips. A divorce? Fine. They both seemed startled by my calm reaction. Marcus raised his eyebrows as if he couldn't believe I'd respond so simply. But I knew that composure was just a thin veneer, because in that very moment, something had awakened inside me. A plan. I didn't ask for explanations. I didn't need them. The betrayal was crystal clear. I simply looked at Marcus steadily, picked up the folder, and walked into my studio. As the door clicked shut behind me, I heard Claire whisper to him, "See? I told you she wouldn't make a scene. Someone that passive, what's there to worry about?" I sat down and spread the divorce papers before me. My hands trembled, but not from heartbreak. From rage. Rage at myself for not recognizing the signs sooner. For allowing two traitors to enter my sanctuary and my life, wearing the masks of victors. Marcus used to tell me I was fortunate to have him, that he was the one tolerating my hobby while I created what he called overpriced mud bowls. I believed him so completely that I didn't notice how I was suffocating in a one-sided marriage where love and respect flowed in only one direction. But not anymore. I stood, walked to my studio mirror, and looked myself directly in the eyes. No tears, just Isabella, the woman who had once been soft, now transforming into something unbreakable. That night, I contacted my lawyer, the same attorney who handled my gallery contracts, and asked her to audit every asset registered under my name. I also accessed a separate bank account where I'd quietly deposited proceeds from my pottery sales, an account whose balance would leave Marcus speechless if he ever discovered it. I had been underestimated, and that was now my greatest advantage. They never saw what was coming. I met Claire when I was 19, during our sophomore year at the University of New Mexico. Her auburn hair always seemed to catch sunlight perfectly, and her infectious laugh had a way of drawing people into her orbit. We shared a dorm room in the arts building. I still remember the first time she confided in me, "You know, Isabella, I've always been attracted to men who are already taken. There's something about the challenge that excites me." I laughed, thinking it was just college humor. However, semester after semester, Claire would mysteriously grow close to her friends' boyfriends, and it always ended with her saying, "I never initiated anything. They made the first move." Still, I remained loyal to her. Partly because Claire had a gift for making you feel special, like you were the only person who truly understood her. The other part, maybe I thought I was different. I believed she'd never betray me, especially since she was the first person I told about my feelings for Marcus, the sculpture major from my advanced ceramics class who later became my husband. When Marcus confessed his feelings for me, I was stunned. For most of that semester, I thought he was interested in Claire. They had collaborated on a mixed media installation project, and I'd seen them laughing together in the art studio more than once. But Marcus chose me, and Claire surprisingly smiled and said, "I'm genuinely happy for you both." And I believed her. We went to different graduate programs, but stayed connected. On weekends, the three of us, Marcus, Claire, and I, would meet at a small cafe in the plaza. We called it our sacred space, where there were no critiques, no gallery pressures, just strong coffee, folk music, and genuine laughter. When I was 30, Claire told me she was engaged to a man named David, a software architect at a major tech company in Austin. The first time I met him, I thought, finally, Claire has found real love. David was gentle and thoughtful, completely different from the flashy men she usually dated. He listened when she spoke, never interrupted, always anticipated her needs like it were second nature. I saw authentic affection in his eyes, and for the first time, I truly hoped her relationship would last. They married a year later in a botanical garden she had always dreamed of. Marcus and I were both there. I even designed their wedding invitations, incorporating elements from both their artistic sensibilities. Claire embraced me tightly and said, "If I could trust anyone for life, it would be you and David." But what Claire never understood was that trust and betrayal cannot coexist. For years into her marriage, Claire began calling me more frequently. Initially, our conversations centered on work. Then, complaints about David, that he was too reserved, that he had lost his passion, that he no longer understood her evolving needs. I encouraged her to communicate openly, to listen, and to invest in their relationship. But now I wonder, did Claire ever truly want to repair anything? Shortly after, Marcus began acting strangely, leaving the house without explanations, chuckling at messages, and hiding his phone screen when I entered the room. And one morning, I glimpsed him texting as a message appeared on his screen, "I miss you too." I suspected something then, but I didn't have the courage to confront it. I was terrified the answer would confirm exactly what I feared. Until that day when Marcus brought Claire into our home, dropped the divorce papers on our table, and stared at me with shameless eyes. And I finally understood. It had all begun years ago. I'd just been too blind to see it. But what I discovered next would reveal that their betrayal was far more calculated and devastating than simple adultery. They hadn't just fallen in love. They had orchestrated my entire downfall for reasons I never could have imagined. 7 years ago, I was there when Claire walked into the fertility clinic, glowing, clutching her positive pregnancy test. She told me before she even told David, her voice trembling with excitement, "Isabella, I'm pregnant. Finally, I have something that's completely mine." I didn't fully understand her words then. It was Marcus who volunteered to drive her to appointments, claiming David was always traveling for work. I remember being surprised, but I smiled and agreed. After all, we were close friends. Everything would be fine if it had remained simple kindness. But gradually, Marcus became obsessively attentive to Claire. He bought her prenatal vitamins, accompanied her to ultrasounds, and even tracked her nutritional intake. I only discovered this when I accidentally found his notebook with detailed entries. Week 18, calcium supplements, avoided caffeine. When I asked about it, he shrugged without hesitation, just helping a friend. Can't you see how absent David is? Claire needs someone reliable. I remained silent, but something inside me shifted undeniably. Marcus's assistance gradually transformed into nights away with excuses, like Claire's having complications. He even took vacation days to attend her birthing classes. I suggested that David should be the one supporting her, that it would strengthen their marriage. But Marcus snapped something he rarely did. "You're being incredibly selfish, Isabella," he barked. "Claire has no one. All you do is sit in your studio playing with clay. You have no concept of what it's like to be alone during pregnancy." I bit my tongue and said nothing, not because he was right, but because if I said another word, I would shatter. When Claire gave birth to a daughter named Sophie, It was Marcus waiting outside the delivery room, not David. I learned this from a nurse who looked at me curiously and said, "You're Mr. Marcus's wife?" He's been so devoted to Miss Claire throughout this journey. I nodded, then quickly turned away to hide the shock rising in my chest. After Sophie was born, things deteriorated rapidly. Marcus was barely home anymore. He spent so much time at Claire's that neighbors began assuming he was Sophie's biological father. Initially, I tried to maintain composure. But the third time Sophie called Marcus Daddy in front of me at a small gathering Claire hosted, it felt like someone had struck me across the face. I quietly poured myself a glass of lemonade, avoiding eye contact, and stepped out onto the patio. But Marcus followed me. "Are you creating problems in your head again?" he asked, his voice half accusatory, half mocking. I turned to face him for the first time in months, looking him directly in the eyes. "What are you doing, Marcus? You treat Sophie like your own child. You're constantly at Claire's as if she's the only person who matters. What about me? What am I to you?" He laughed lightly, as if I'd said something absurd. "Isabella, you just don't understand. Claire needs me. David isn't sensitive enough to support her properly. I'm simply doing what's right." "And me?" I asked, my voice strained from holding back emotions. He paused, then turned away. "You're too independent, Isabella. You don't need anyone." That statement pierced me like an ice-cold needle. Yes, I'm independent. I know how to care for myself, to build my own world. But that doesn't mean I want to be forgotten or quietly replaced by the person who used to be my dearest friend. From that day forward, there was a chasm between Marcus and me that nothing could bridge. He continued moving between our home and Claire's, still using helping Claire as his excuse. But we both knew what existed between them was no longer friendship. But what I didn't know yet was that their relationship was part of something much larger and more sinister than simple infidelity. That afternoon, as I was glazing pottery in my studio behind the house, the doorbell rang with a firm, purposeful tone, like someone who knew exactly why they were there. I opened the door to find David's weary, determined eyes. He looked more worn than when I'd last seen him, with dark circles despite his neat appearance. In his hands was a thick file bound in black leather. No small talk. David got straight to the point. "I think it's time we talked." I invited him in and brewed strong coffee. Once we were seated, he placed the file on the table and slid it toward me. "I hired a forensic accountant 6 months ago," he said slowly. "Initially, I thought Claire was just hiding expenses from me. I never expected to uncover what I found. I didn't open the folder immediately. My heart pounded, my chest heavy like a stone pressing down on it. But I kept my expression neutral, trying to remain composed." David continued, "They've been systematically draining our accounts, yours and mine. There are forged signatures, unauthorized transfers, even fake investment schemes they've been running using our identities." I went numb. "This isn't just an affair," I whispered. "No," David said grimly. "It's elaborate financial fraud. They've stolen over $200,000 from me alone. And based on what I've discovered, they've been planning this for years." He opened the file and showed me bank statements, forged documents, and transaction records that made my blood run cold. "Why tell me this?" I asked after a long silence. David looked at me intently, his voice low. "Because I know you're not like them. You have integrity. And I don't want other innocent people to become their next victims." He exhaled deeply, weariness evident in his eyes. "I've already contacted the FBI. They're building a case for wire fraud, identity theft, and conspiracy. But they need more evidence." I nodded, understanding. Just as I'd stayed quiet while Marcus disappeared night after night, afraid that exposing everything would destroy innocent Sophie, the child I didn't birth but loved like my own. "I'm not planning to stay silent," I said, my voice steady as steel. "But I'm not going to act recklessly either. Not when it could hurt Sophie." David nodded. "Then we work together. Carefully, strategically. Wait until we have everything we need to protect the innocent and expose the guilty." I started gathering evidence systematically, every email, text message, Marcus's schedules, even suspicious credit card charges. David did the same with Claire's activities. We shared everything quietly, like allies in a covert operation. Claire and Marcus had no idea they were being watched. They continued playing their roles as loving partners in front of others, still hugging Sophie and smiling like life was a romantic comedy without consequences. But I knew the truth would surface. And when it did, I'd be the one holding all the cards. I was no longer the naive woman who believed in 15 years of friendship. No longer the wife who sat by the window waiting for her husband to return home, pretending not to notice the unfamiliar perfume on his clothes. I was Isabella, the woman reclaiming everything that had been stolen from her, one careful step at a time. But what David and I discovered next would reveal that Marcus and Claire weren't just thieves. They were part of a sophisticated criminal network that had been targeting artists and creative professionals across the Southwest for over a decade. David and I met every weekend under the pretense of co-parenting arrangements for Sophie. No one questioned us. To outsiders, we were two mature adults sharing responsibility for a child's well-being. But only we knew that every smile, every nod was part of a long-term strategy. Once, as Sophie napped on the couch, David looked at me and whispered, "I used to think Claire was someone I could trust completely." I smiled sadly. I thought the same about Marcus. No more words were needed, just a shared understanding and the quiet determination of those who had been wounded too deeply to tremble anymore. During one of our evidence-gathering sessions, David made a discovery that changed everything we thought we knew about Marcus and Claire's operation. "Isabella," he said, his voice tense as he showed me his laptop screen, "I found something that explains everything." On the screen was a detailed spreadsheet listing dozens of names, addresses, and financial profiles. All artists, writers, musicians, and other creative professionals across New Mexico, Arizona, and Colorado. "They're not just stealing from us," David said grimly. "They're part of a network that specifically targets people in creative fields. Look at this." He scrolled through the document, revealing a systematic approach to financial fraud that was breathtakingly organized. They identify successful artists who are financially independent but socially isolated. Then they insert themselves into their lives through fake friendships or romantic relationships. Once they gain trust, they begin the systematic theft. I stared at the screen in horror. How many victims? At least 47 that I can identify. And Isabella. He paused, his expression grave. 3 of them died under suspicious circumstances after discovering the theft. My blood ran cold. Died how? Car accidents. All single-vehicle crashes on remote mountain roads. All after they'd discovered the financial irregularities and threatened to expose the network. I sat back in my chair, the full scope of what we were dealing with finally becoming clear. "We're not just dealing with adultery and theft," I said quietly. "We're dealing with organized crime. Possibly murder." David nodded. "The FBI agent I've been working with says this could be one of the largest financial fraud networks targeting creative professionals in the country's history." That night, I looked at Marcus differently when he came home. This wasn't just the man who had betrayed our marriage. This was someone potentially involved in serious crimes, including possible murder. But I kept my expression neutral, continued playing the role of the unsuspecting wife. Because now I understood that our investigation wasn't just about personal justice, it was about protecting other innocent artists from becoming victims. And possibly preventing my own mysterious accident on a remote desert road. The next morning, David called with urgent news. "Isabella, you need to be very careful. I found communications suggesting that you and I are being discussed as problems that need to be resolved. I think they know we're investigating." I looked out my studio window at the vast desert landscape, suddenly seeing it not as peaceful isolation, but as the perfect place for someone to disappear without a trace. "What do we do?" I asked. "We accelerate our timeline," David said. "The FBI is ready to move. But we need to get you somewhere safe first." That afternoon, I made a decision that would either save my life or put me in greater danger. Instead of running, I would set a trap. Because if Marcus and Claire were planning to eliminate me, I was going to make sure they walked directly into the arms of federal agents when they tried. I called Marcus and told him I'd discovered a significant error in my bank accounts, money that appeared to be missing. I said I needed his help reviewing the financial records that evening. Of course, he said, his voice suddenly very interested. I'll be right there. As I hung up the phone, I touched the small recording device the FBI had given me, hidden beneath my shirt. Tonight, Marcus would reveal the truth about everything, or I might not live to see tomorrow's sunrise. But I was no longer the passive woman who had sat quietly while her life was stolen piece by piece. I was Isabella, the artist who was about to create her masterpiece, the perfect trap for the people who had tried to destroy her. The recording device felt cold against my skin as I waited for Marcus to arrive. Outside my studio window, FBI agents were positioned throughout the desert landscape, invisible but ready. Marcus arrived exactly on time, carrying a bottle of wine and wearing the smile that had once made me feel loved. Now it just looked predatory. "You sounded worried on the phone," he said, settling into the chair across from my pottery wheel. "Tell me about these banking discrepancies." I pulled out a folder of fabricated financial documents, carefully prepared by the FBI to look like I'd discovered their theft. "Marcus, there are transactions here I don't remember making. Large transfers to accounts I've never seen. And they all seem to require your signature as well as mine." His eyes flickered with something between interest and caution. "That's strange. Let me take a look." As he reviewed the fake documents, I watched his expression carefully. The man I'd lived with for 15 years was calculating something, and it wasn't how to help me. "These do look suspicious," he said finally. "But Isabella, you need to be very careful about who you share this information with. If someone is stealing from you, they might try to silence you." The irony was almost laughable. "What do you mean?" Marcus leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper. "I've heard about artists in the area who've had problems after discovering financial irregularities. Some of them ended up in serious accidents." My blood chilled, but I kept my voice steady. "What kind of accidents?" "Car crashes, mostly. On those winding mountain roads. Very dangerous, especially for someone driving alone at night." He was threatening me. Right to my face, he was describing how I might die if I didn't stay quiet about the theft. "Maybe I should contact the police," I said, testing his reaction. Marcus's hand shot out and grabbed my wrist, not gently, but with enough force to leave marks. "I wouldn't do that if I were you, Isabella. The people involved in this kind of operation don't like loose ends." "What people?" I asked, even though I already knew. Marcus smiled, and for the first time in 15 years, I saw him without any mask at all. "People like me," he said simply. "People who've built very successful businesses targeting naive artists who think their little pottery sales make them wealthy." My heart pounded, but I forced myself to remain calm. "You've been stealing from me." Stealing is such an ugly word. I prefer to think of it as redirecting resources from people who don't understand how to use money properly. He stood up and began pacing around my studio, touching my pottery with casual disregard. "You know, Isabella, you could have made this so much easier. If you'd just signed those divorce papers and agreed to the monthly payments, you could have lived quietly in some little apartment, making your mud bowls, never knowing how much we'd taken." "We?" "Claire and I, obviously. And the rest of our network." "Did you really think this was just about an affair?" He laughed, a sound that made my skin crawl. "We've been planning this for 7 years, ever since we realized how much money you'd been hiding in your little art accounts. Claire befriended you in college specifically to get close to your family's financial situation." The words hit me like physical blows. Claire was never really my friend? God, no. She couldn't stand you, actually. All that earnest artistic passion, the way you believed everyone was as honest as you are. It made her sick. Marcus walked over to where I sat and looked down at me with contempt. but you were perfect for our purposes. Successful, isolated, trusting, easy to manipulate. He paused, studying my face. The only problem now is that you know too much. What are you saying? Marcus reached into his jacket and pulled out something that made my blood freeze, a small vial of clear liquid. I'm saying that tomorrow morning, they'll find you in your studio, dead from an apparent pottery glaze poisoning. Tragic accident. Very common among ceramic artists who don't handle their chemicals properly. I stared at the vial, understanding that I was looking at my own planned murder. And then Claire and I will be so grief-stricken that we'll need to comfort each other. Poor David will understand, of course. And we'll all share the responsibility of raising little Sophie together. While inheriting everything I've worked for, I said quietly. Exactly. You're finally beginning to understand. Marcus opened the vial and took a step toward me. That's when the studio door burst open and FBI agents flooded in, weapons drawn. Federal agents. Drop the vial and step away from her. Marcus spun around, his face cycling through shock, rage, and finally resignation as he realized he'd been completely outmaneuvered. As they handcuffed him, he looked at me with pure hatred. You think you've won? Claire will disappear. The network will find new victims. This doesn't end with me. But FBI agent Sarah Chin, who had been coordinating our investigation, smiled grimly. Actually, Mr. Marcus, while you were confessing to murder conspiracy, we were simultaneously arresting Claire and 16 other members of your network across 4 states. It ends tonight. 6 months later, I stood in a federal courthouse in Albuquerque, watching as Marcus was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole for conspiracy to commit murder, racketeering, and financial fraud. Claire received 25 years for her role in the network. David and I had testified about the systematic targeting of artists and the sophisticated methods they'd used to steal hundreds of thousands of dollars from creative professionals across the Southwest. But the most important testimony came from Sophie herself. Now old enough to understand what had happened, she chose to stay with David rather than visit Claire in prison. She was never really my mother, Sophie told the judge during the custody hearing. She was just someone who gave birth to me and then used me as part of her crimes. David was granted full custody, and I became Sophie's legal guardian as well, not because of biology, but because of the love we'd built through years of genuine care. After the trial, I returned to my studio with a new perspective on life. The FBI had recovered most of the stolen money, and I used it to establish a foundation that provides financial security and legal assistance to artists who've been targeted by fraud. My pottery had evolved too. Where once I created vessels that captured the desert's beauty, now I make pieces that tell stories of survival, resilience, and the strength that comes from refusing to be a victim. One evening, as I worked on a new collection in my studio, David knocked on the door. He'd been coming by regularly since the trial, not as a fellow victim anymore, but as someone who'd become genuinely important to me. I brought dinner, he said, holding up containers from the new restaurant in town. Thought you might be hungry. I smiled, setting down my clay tools. I'm always hungry after a long day of creating. As we sat together eating and watching the sunset paint the desert in brilliant colors, David asked quietly, "Do you ever regret it? Going through all that to expose them?" I considered his question, looking out at the landscape that had once seemed like perfect isolation for a crime, but now felt like a sanctuary again. No, I said finally. Because sometimes the only way to stop being a victim is to become the person who fights back. David nodded, reaching over to squeeze my hand. Sophie's lucky to have you. We both are. I looked at this man who had started as a fellow victim and become something much more, a partner in the truest sense, someone who understood that real love is built on trust, honesty, and mutual respect. I used to think my art was about capturing beauty, I told him. Now I know it's about transforming pain into something meaningful. That night, as I worked late in my studio, I reflected on how completely my life had changed. Marcus and Claire had tried to destroy me, but they'd accidentally given me something invaluable, the knowledge of my own strength, and the ability to help others find theirs. My pottery was selling better than ever, not just because of the technical skill, but because each piece now carried a story of survival that resonated with people across the country. And most importantly, I'd learned that some betrayals don't break you, they reveal exactly how unbreakable you were all along. Sometimes the greatest art comes not from inspiration, but from transformation. And sometimes the most beautiful vessels are the ones that have been through fire and emerged stronger than before. Isabella's story proves that even the most devastating betrayal can become the foundation for something extraordinary. She didn't just survive, she transformed her pain into purpose, her isolation into strength, and her art into a force for justice. In a world full of people who prey on trust, she chose to rebuild rather than retreat. And that choice made all the difference.